Foundation. As you know, that EGROW Foundation is a policy-oriented think tank, and we believe in research-based policy advice. We've been doing these webinars for nearly 2 years now, and the aim and objective of this webinar series is to discuss contemporary economic policy issues that can help the policymaker. We have had the privilege of having the best minds from across the world speak on our forum, and we have tried to have a 50-50, 50% Indians and 50% foreigners speak to us. Also been very fortunate to have speakers from the best universities across the world, best institutions, and also two Nobel laureates. It is in this very context that today we have Ruchir from IMF, and he's speaking on the economics of talent and human potential. To chair the session today, we have Dr. Arvind Virmani, our chairman of EGROW Foundation. As you are aware, Dr. Arvind Virmani was the chief economic advisor of our country and also the executive director representing India at International Monetary Fund in Washington from 2009 to 2012. He's been a scholar and researcher and published extensively even in referee journals. He has research-based, policy-oriented books to his credit. We invite him now to please chair the session.
Thank you, Charan, and welcome to Ruchir Agarwal, who I see has also done his PhD from Harvard University, my alma mater. But I must say, you know, in my time as ED IMF, I was very happy to see that a lot of Indians like Ruchir in the research area, you know, and the best minds I found you know, when the some of the policies of the IMF and I disagreed with, when I went and talked to the professionals behind the scene, they were always the best, and many of them were Indian. So we're glad to have you, Ruchir. Of course, as mentioned in the introduction, he is head of the IMF Global Health and Pandemic Task Force and lead on multilateral leaders task force. But we really appreciate that you're going to tell us about a national talent policy based on research work of everybody. I mean, we always like our listeners to get educated on the best research, especially research which has policy implications. With that, over to you, Ruchir.
Excellent. Can you all hear me clearly? Yes. Excellent. So thank you so much, Dr. Virmani and Dr. Singh, for inviting me. Exactly as Dr. Virmani has said, my goal here is to make this interesting for you. So my goal is to bring in the work that a lot of people in this area are doing, and also some of my own published and ongoing work. So to tell the story and not make it so academic, but more policy oriented. Let me start by, of course, a disclaimer. These views are not representing necessarily the IMF's institutional view. They are research and meant to stimulate discussion and debate. So if you go to the next slide, what do I really mean by economics of human potential and talent? What I want to do is talk to you about four things in the next 30 to 40 minutes. First is the first bullet is really more India specific, which is why inclusive growth is essential for high growth. And this is something I developed recently for another presentation I did last month in India when I was there. And then what I want to do is build the next, let's say, pillars of my talk on then why talent policy matters for inclusive and high growth. What are the barriers for talent and policy implications? So that's kind of the four areas I want to talk to you about. This is going to be, as I said, based on published and ongoing work of many people. When no reference will be cited, you can imagine that it's ongoing preliminary work, and just for discussion now, it's not published yet. All right, so let's get started then. On the first part, which is more the India-focused part, is why inclusive growth is essential for high growth. So if you go to the next slide, this is very well understood by colleagues in India. But basically, what I'm going to show you is the variation in income across geographies and families in India in the next 5 to 10 minutes. So So this is just a map that comes from the internet, actually, from some company, where what they did was just look at, given the India's state's PPP GDP per capita, compare that to other countries. And what I want you to focus really on is the two red parts, which are Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. As you all know, about 1 in 4 people in India live in those states. So that's about 1 in 25 people in the world live in those states. And if you compare the income in those states, for example, take Bihar versus Haryana, the difference is about 5.5 times. Or take Maharashtra versus UP, the difference is 3 times. So there's huge benefit for convergence in income across states. A lot of people have talked about kind of an investment-led growth and where would that financing come from. But what I want to encourage you all to think a little bit more about is a lot of the growth can also come from convergence by replicating what works well in some parts of the countries with the other parts. So if you go to the next slide, then this is this ongoing work that I'm trying to do, which the next before one slide before, which is one slide before the other side, and one more. Yeah, exactly. So this is now looking within the states at the district level. And this is actually, I've been able to put this together for 1 year, which is 2004. This data is much more sparse for other years, but the broad pattern exists that even within states, if you look at Uttar Pradesh, the difference between high income districts in Uttar Pradesh compared to low income districts is roughly 5 times. So even within state, taking that kind of equality of opportunity across geographies has a big value. And then if you go to the next slide, which we had jumped to, which is what we're doing is with some ongoing work with my co-author Patrick Golay at the University of Bristol. We're looking, okay, let's look at within districts, and one way to do that and to bring this issue of talent is look at JEE scores. So as we know, the joint entrance exam is one path for success for many Indians. And if the blues here are the people who are in the top 1% of the JEE in a given year. This is for 2011, where I could get the data for, and the reds are bottom 10%. And you see large variation, of course, across the country, but even within district level, you often find large variation. So you can have two PIN codes within the same district. One can be one of the very top performing PIN codes. Another can be very poorly performing PIN codes. So there's, I know next week you're going to have a speaker, Geeta Kingdon, who is going to be talking more about education. So I'm going to be giving a bit more macro perspective of that here. So that's kind of, I wanted to emphasize. And if you go to the next slide, is within the PIN code, if you look at outcomes for families. So here, this is this work that I mentioned that I'm doing with Patrick Golay. What we did is we built a data set of all Indians by every Indian who's out there using the electoral records. And we're looking at who is patenting, who is writing papers, who are doing scientific outputs in India. So people like the Agarwals, you can say, have very high patenting per capita, but other last names often do not. And so one way to quantify that is to think through what here you're seeing is a Gini inequality type thing, but instead of income is inequality in patenting activity. And line of equality, as you know from the Gini from income, is the dotted line. So that's the 45-degree line. And India is the red. And for comparison, you have China and US. In those countries, the dimension of inequality of opportunity may not be based on surnames, so it doesn't pick up there. But in India, surnames tends to be a high predictive power of education or access to opportunities. And in one summary statistic is roughly 1% of surnames in India. The top 1% account for roughly half of all patents in India or publications. So this logic of convergence across geographies also apply to the logic across families. And so if we have the same, if we can, of course, these things have a long history of issues, and it's quite complex, but this is just a very high level initial data point that I wanted to just park in your minds before we move on to the next stage. So this is kind of bringing me to the end of the first pillar of my talk about, if you go to the next slide, the main message there, key takeaway, and we can have a much deeper discussion later, is, there is really no trade-off between inclusive growth and high growth, which is different than this classic debate on inequality and growth. Here, I want to emphasize more about equality of opportunity. And if you think about more than almost 1 billion people in India have, based on the surnames alone, you can predict have uh, basically near zero chance of being active in any scientific endeavors. So India is a country of 1.4 billion, but it may be operating as a country of 400 million when it comes to its innovation potential. So the logic here is simply by finding ways, and that's the discussion we'll come to, the policies to expand that opportunity to unleash its innovation potential. And that's not just going to be good for India, but it's going to be good for the world, especially in a world where finding good ideas may be harder to find. So that's kind of the first message from the first pillar. Let's go to the second part of the talk, then diving a bit deeper into why talent policy may matter for inclusive and high growth. Here, if you go to the next slide, I want to focus on two papers that are quite interesting. One is from Francisco Quero, who was actually my classmate, and he wrote this paper 10 years ago. It just finally got published in the Review of Economic Studies. And this is based on data from Portugal. And the second paper is with my frequent co-author, Patrick Gollet, which is in the AER Insights 2 years ago. So let's go into the next slide. I just want to show you two sides from Francisco's paper. So what he does is he looks at he gets access to all firms in Portugal, and he matches it to the education histories of the managers. And so this is a cohort of firms in 1995 that started in 1995, and he's just asking what happened to how quickly these firms grew based on, and how did it depend on the education attainment of the managers of these firms. And basically the key message is, if you see the light green line, which is on the top, the diamonds, that's basically where the entrepreneur had 15 to 17 years of schooling. And you compare that to the yellow one, which is when they had 12 to 15 years of schooling. Within 5 years, that difference led to basically the firm size being double. There is a lot of discussion in India now on size of plants and what barriers there are. But one thing that I found really interesting from what Francisco was bringing into the debate is the returns to human capital may be actually much larger when you take into account the interaction between managerial human capital and what that means for firm productivity. And I come from a family background. We are a family of entrepreneurs, and one limitation often in the SME sector, for example, in India, often is delegation, right? So I think there is a very interesting angle to be explored here, what this means in the Indian context. And that's why I just wanted to share this with you all, because this, I think, is just the tip of the iceberg into thinking about the role of human capital for productivity. Let's go to the next one, which is the next slide is on the basically also from Francisco's paper. Here's just showing one addition. So it's not just the top part of the distribution. In a high income country like Portugal, does that managerial schooling matter? Even lower down in the schooling distribution, one additional year of schooling was associated with productivity increase of 5%. So that's something, to me, is a first order evidence to think about human capital in a more in a different light than we've been thinking about traditionally. Let's go to the next slide. So here, this is based on my work with Patrick. Let me give you, before you look into the slide, a quick preview of what we really do. What we are interested, so before we talked about productivity of firms, what other part of my research is thinking about, where will groundbreaking ideas come from? If productivity growth in the world is slowing, how can we accelerate the knowledge and the innovation frontier? And in this context, we've been studying mathematicians for almost 10 years now, and we use the world of mathematics as a laboratory. And one of the beautiful things about mathematics is you have this high school competition, the International Math Olympiad, which takes place with 100 countries in the world participate over that number, and you can kind of observe talent at a very young age, and these kids often end up being the leaders in the field later in their lifetime. So here, this is a high school competition, the International Math Olympiad. India is doing quite well now as well. The score is out of 42. The average is roughly 16. Okay. Yes, sir.
What is this IMO? We are not familiar. Can you just
That's what I'm, yes. International Math Olympiad. Yes. International Math Olympiad. Thanks for clarifying. I appreciate that very much. So that's what I was trying to say. IMO, International Math Olympiad, high school competition, typically 16, 17, 18-year-olds competing, the best minds in math from each country. The top 8% get a gold medal. Average score is 16. The total test is out of 42. And what this is showing is no matter where you're born, on average, just getting one additional point on this score, on this competition in your high school, which is a 1/10 of a standard deviation. So that tiny difference is associated with you having 5% more citations in your lifetime productivity. So if you is a measure of how much value of science you're creating is just citations. So many of these kids end up becoming mathematicians or other scientists, and just the talent at the high school level, the key message here is, has a very strong correlation with what's happening later in life. And if you go to the next slide, in fact, it's so big, what the next slide shows is, if you're in the top 8%, if this cohort, so the gold medalists, you compare gold medalists at the high school level to PhDs from the top 10 math programs, like MIT, Princeton, Harvard, Cambridge of the world. The gold medalists at the high school level are 50 times more likely to win the Fields Medal in math, which is like the Nobel Prize for math. So there is something very special about the right tail of the distribution. And my goal here was to kind of show you two parts: the frontier innovation, which is this paper, and the previous one was kind of the standard productivity across the the middle part of the productivity range. So keep message here, if it was not so clear. Thanks for the clarification, Dr. Virmani. But the key message is talent seems to matter quite strongly, both for the bread and butter productivity as we think about it from a firm side, but also for frontier innovation in science. Okay, and let's move to the next slide, which basically summarizes what I've just, before I do that, so this is really interesting. So this is where I take the global perspective. So here we are comparing two people with the same score. So x-axis is the point scored at high school level at the IMO, and y-axis is whether you end up getting a PhD in math. The same thing happens for PhD in other fields, but basic point is a dark line is rich if you're born in a rich country, and the gray line is if you're born in a developing country. And the key message is roughly, your chance of success or being part of a knowledge field is roughly 50% lower, despite having very large innovation potential. And so that's the logic that we want to talk about. The title of this paper is Invisible Geniuses, that there's a huge potential of talent that may be underutilized in developing countries, which can be basically help raise potential. Yes, Dr. Virmani.
So you're leaving out middle income countries. You're just comparing the high and the low income, right?
Exactly. The middle income is there. It's basically,
not on the graph though. It's not
in the graph. It's not there. In the paper is there for visual ease. Middle income would be in the middle, basically.
That's fine.
Exactly. So it's a gradient. It's a gradient exactly as you imagined. Exactly. Perfect.
Okay.
I really appreciate these clarifications. So please keep it coming, Dr. Virmani, because if it's not clear to you, it must not be clear to many other people.
I know what the people will be wondering, so that's why I'm asking them. Yeah.
Perfect. Perfect.
Okay, go ahead.
So let's go to the next one. And basically, the next slide is summarizing the main points from the second pillar of the talk. Why does identifying and nurturing talent matter? The case to be made, and I've just given you tip of the iceberg, is talent matters for innovation and productivity. But if talent is not nurtured, identified, nurtured, rewarded, especially based on where you're born, who you are, it can hamper innovation and growth. And so basically the talent policy then not only becomes a moral issue, right? This is something that hits our hearts, but it's not just a moral issue, but also very much a macro and growth issue. And that's kind of what I want to bring to this conversation, is to have macro-oriented people like us, collectively bring talent more into the conversation. So let's go to the next two parts of the talk. So the third part, now I'm moving to the third part. So I wanted to give you some really cool work that's happening to just show you what's potential, how, the creativity or the talent of the economist to study talent. So that's what I wanted to show you here. So if you go to the why talent, what barriers do talent face? So first is this paper coming from Raj Chetty and team, very famous paper. Basically, what they do is they get access to the tax records and of Americans. So this is for the US. And on the x-axis is the percentile of your parents' income. Okay, so 100 means you're in the top 1%, but the 5 means you're in the bottom 5%, right? And the y-axis is how many of them have patent holders in the future. So number of inventors per thousand of children. The bottom half of the distribution have roughly 0.85 per thousand become inventors. In the top, it's about 10 times more, the top 1%. Okay, so so what I showed you for the JEE, you remember in India, it's not something that is necessarily India specific. The margins of inequality can be very different in different countries, but there is something deeper in terms of the equality of opportunity that exists across. So let me show you another one, which is basically this from another professor of mine, Philippe Aguillon. The next slide is from Finland. Okay, so the next slide is they're doing the same exercise with using a really cool data set from Finland, where they also have your IQ scores because of the army, because of the army requirements. So they match the IQ scores to your family income, to your lifetime professional choice, career options or career outcomes. And so the blue is, again, whether you become an inventor or not. So y-axis is probability of becoming an inventor. X-axis is the father's income percentile. Very similar relationship, but also what's cool is they also show the same thing holding for whether you become a doctor, so MD, or whether you become a lawyer, and here education is free. So it is not, one important thing is this idea that the socioeconomic barriers to opportunity may be much harder and deeper to solve, and it's not something necessarily just the feature of one or two countries. It may be a more prevalent feature, but the way it manifests itself can differ based on the history and the social structure of the country. So let's go to the next slide. Effectively, what here I do is I summarize this paper, which I really like. I really love this paper because it's really trying to go deep into understanding the mechanisms of these social origins of IQ, they call it, and inventors. And the story they basically lay out is, if you have educated and rich parents, they can provide a better home and family environment, a better socioeconomic status, which then allows the kids to have higher IQ, which then increases the chance of them becoming doctors, inventors, or lawyers. And this is true even in an environment when education is free. So if you think about the scope of policy, right? Something society can do, and then something neighborhoods can do, and then something families can do. And what this is saying is there are some things, so much you can do by doing education policy, but there are other sets of things that need to be done that look deeper into the boundaries of what's happening within the families. All right, so let's go to the next slide. Basically, some implications for policy. All right, so if you go to the next, what I've shown you a preview of basically is children of the rich are often successful because they can create better environment. This is kind of a broad statement that can apply, to many jurisdictions. Now, what can they really afford? Why? I mean, what can they afford to do differently? They can spend more money on child enrichment, on nutrition, the quality of time they spend, the amount of time they spend, the quality of neighborhoods, quality of education. Let me give you a few examples of that. So if you go to the next slide, this is something coming from the field of neuroscience. So these co-authors, this group of researchers, what they did was they took 6-year-olds and they gave them a audio file to listen over the weekend, and basically they listened to these conversations, and they came back into their labs next week, and they measured basically the white matter and how much basically was their brain activity stimulated based on just listening to more or less conversations on this audio file. And what they found was just doubling the amount of conversations you listen to, right? And the hypothesis they're trying to test is, do parents talking more to the kids? Like, how was the day? What do you think about this, etc., etc.? Does that change how your brain develops? As opposed to just you sitting and watching in front of the TV, right? So does conversation change how your brain develops? And they're finding, this is very early work in neuroscience, that this tends to matter. And there's some more work showing that the way the brains develop for the same background, just different incomes, can vary just because of the opportunities, not necessarily the biology, but the opportunities available socially to kids. If you go to the next slide, there is in the next slide. So this is another very cool work by Raj and Nate Hendren. So what they do is, so this is the second point I want to make here is about neighborhoods matter. Okay. So what they do is they compare families that move from a worse neighborhood in Manhattan, where the average income in that neighborhood was 30,000, to a better neighborhood in Queens, where the average income was 40,000. Okay. And they're looking at the age of the child when they move, what happens to their lifetime outcomes. Okay. And they can look within families, so they can look at a brother who is older compared to a younger brother, how their lifetime outcomes differ. So the way to read this graph is, if you're a 10-year-old when you move from a lower, from this worse neighborhood to a better neighborhood, your income looks 60% closer to what the better neighborhood average income is. But for every additional year later you move, so if you move after you're 22, 23, basically you get no neighborhood effects. You don't get the benefit of having moved to a better neighborhood. Your lifetime outcome looks much more like the neighborhood you were born in. So that's just a very creative and beautiful way to use within family variation to show neighborhoods matter, even in high-income countries like the US. Okay. The next one here, I just want to show you on the next one is, quality of education matters. And this is a bit outdated. It's from a paper from Reardon in 2011. I just want you to focus on the red graph. What the red shows is the year, x-axis is the year you're born in, x-axis is the year you're born in, y-axis in the red is just saying, what is the gap between the 90-10 income? So if your family is in the top 10 percentile versus the bottom 10 percentile, what is the reading gap in your standardized reading scores? Okay, and that's the red. So if you're born in 1940, the 90-10 gap was roughly 3/4 of a standard deviation. The sad and worrying thing is this has grown over time, and so it's really hard. The main message I want you all to take from here is it's often really hard to close the opportunity gap between in quality of education. So overall, if you go to the next slide, the idea here is I want to start the conversation is families, neighborhoods, schools, nutrition. These things can matter for macro outcomes. There's a lot of work on these at the micro level, but I want to push a little bit as to think from a macro perspective how this matters. And in a way, I think what's really hard, and this is something speculative, bullet 2, I think what's really hard to tackle intergeneration inequality is there some complementarities. You may solve, you may remove one road, bottleneck on someone's road on the path to success, but the other bottlenecks are not removed. So there needs a more strategic macro level thinking to have complementary and sustained investment so that the path to success is clear. Now, how can one do this sitting in New Delhi or in the capital of a country? One idea I have is, and this is something I want to write more on, is can we think about a cohort-based macro fiscal policy. So for example, we think about macro policies at geographies, like in different states or fiscal spending by state or by spending category. But can we think about fiscal spending by how it changes the life of each cohort, right? So Virmani, born in Chhattisgarh, right, in the year 1970. Is that those Virmanis doing compared to the ones that were born 10 years later? And kind of monitor and quantify what's going on and learn from where these different cohorts are actually doing much better, why they're doing better, and have that strategic. So that's kind of my thinking on that I want to develop more, is the cohort-based perspective for macro fiscal policy. So now, in the last few minutes that I want to just, as closing thought, that's the next slide, is I just want to give couple more slides, okay? It's concluding thoughts. So the first one, if you go to the next, what I've tried to present here, what I call, I've not defined economics of human potential and talent, so I just want to define it a little bit, is just the elements of it, let's say, is a two-stage framework, before and after your talent type is known. Okay, from an ex ante perspective, so before, we should, the economics of human potential and talent from a policy perspective aims to create an environment where all kids can realize their human potential regardless of the socioeconomic status. And from an ex post perspective, once you know at different stages of your life that you are highly talented, can you nurture that talent and reward that talent? And those who are, unfortunate and are relatively less talented, can we expand the social safety net to make sure that they are also not left behind, right? And the last slide, which is the next one, is I've not shown any equations so far, but I have to, straight to show that I'm not fully obsolete, at least put one equation there. And here is my thinking on a twist, let's say, on what GDP per capita means. We all know a GDP per capita, as we define it, is output per individual. How many output is a country producing divided by the population of the country? But one could decompose this in two components, which is the next slide, is you could break it into two. You could just multiply and divide by talent, and think about it is, per unit of talent, what is the return on talent? Do we have the right enabling environment to convert talent into output? And the second is, for every child who's born, what is their chance of realizing their human potential? So what is the talent per capita? So in a way, that's what I when I think about this, at least in my own mind, that's how I'm framing it, which is the economics of human potential and talent is about enabling each individual to realize their human potential and boost their return on talent by enabling them to excel and flourish. So that's my talk, and I try to stay within 30 minutes or so we can have a lot of time for conversation and debate, discussions as you wish.
Thank you. So let me, before I come to Dr. Bhalla, let me just ask a few questions. One is a broader question from your first slide on India. My impression from when I was doing this stuff about 10, 15 years ago was that the real problem was in the heartland. That inequality stuff which you showed, we had done district-wise, and we had tried to develop some policies, set up a company for addressing this, etc., when I was in the Planning Commission. But what I noticed from your graph is that it seemed to be moving towards the Himalayas, to the foothills. I mean, it's more, do you have any comment on that, or whether it's true, whether there's a hypothesis, whatever? So that's one general sort of question. The second one, you've not really addressed, but maybe you come across it in your research. So one of the things we have been pushing at EGROW is the use of, e-learning, e-skilling, because my broad judgment, well, I did a paper for the Planning Commission, review of public, health and education, etc. And basically, at that time, I came to the conclusion that, that given the quality gap and the huge population, there was no way to close the quality gap, let's say the average quality of education, skilling, etc. in Europe or high income countries generally, or upper middle even, with where we were in India. The only way, and given all the limitations of getting teachers, good quality teachers down to the rural areas, etc., that the only way to do it was to use the internet and use online training, whatever. I mean, whether it's through of teachers, whatever, whether it's training with users, whatever. So the question is, do you have any more information than that based on other people's research, what you have read, etc.? Can you give us some pointers on that particular issue? So if you want to say anything on these two, then we'll turn to other questions.
On the first question, I think there is definitely a Bihar and Uttar Pradesh fixed effect, and so that income divergence seems to have persisted. So I did not put a chart there, but if you look at the state level, for example, that I've done an exercise where I've looked at the last 60 years of growth across states, and it seems there are like 4 convergence clubs. Within each convergence club, it appears that the neoclassical prediction holds. That is, the poorer states grow faster. But there is a intercept term that varies. And so in the last group of the convergence club is definitely Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. And one thing I'm trying to do there, 2 things, just correlation, 2 things that seem to matter. One is distance from the big 6 urban centers, right? So you just put Google Maps and how far is the big. And this is just very shallow, but it needs to be understood why. Second, what I was looking at, and again, and I don't know how to interpret this, is very, very preliminary, is duration of colonial rule, not the type of institutions, but how quickly they were they fell into the British rule. So in a way, if you look at it, the initial expansion happens starting from West Bengal into the northeast and a bit to the south, and those 2 factors seem to have a large but this could be just correlation, and that's something I think is a first order question. And if anybody has I just want to say one thing, has the bandwidth to figure out where any district is changed very quickly, I think that's where the goal is, to figure out kind of what is working and what's different. And my conjecture is it must be not just one thing, right? Investing in skills, or it has to be kind of a comprehensive thing. And so figuring that formula and trying to see what can be done to replicate, I think that would be one of the highest returns from my humble perspective. On your second question, I think there's a parallel to this e-learning thing in the US economics of education literature, which I'm not an expert on, but just an interested reader. My reading of that literature is that throwing money on at the problem has not been effective. So you just spend more, you don't solve the problem. Similarly, if you just give a laptop, often doesn't solve problems. And my conjecture is more evidence when it comes into the e-learning, we may find something similar. I don't know this literature well, but the main thing that the work I'm doing on talent, one of the main things is that soft information matters a lot, mentoring matters a lot. So having the pathway, right? Having access to the information, everyone has access to the same textbooks that you had access to in grad school or I had access to. But why doesn't that create more economies? You can record all the lectures, but we may not be able to learn how to ask the questions. And the soft skills, I think, are very important. So that's just my conjecture. I don't have a good empirical response. But my conjecture would be complementary investments probably are likely to have higher returns than just solving the e-learning problem. minimum. Yeah.
Sure. So if you come across any literature, perhaps, or some references, I'd appreciate if you can pass it on to Dr. Charan Singh. Yeah, thanks.
I will compile that for you.
Yeah, thank you. Surjit, Dr. Bala, would you like to ask or make a comment on general on education and other things relevant? Yeah.
Yeah. No, fascinating set of results and objectives. I have two or three first clarification. I didn't quite understand that moving to a better neighborhood, what's the process by which it increases your earnings, if I understood that right. Second, and there's a steep slope in your graphs once you go past 60% or so. Very, very steep, so almost vertical. So I don't know how to interpret that. You know, you need a critical mass, or what is causing that? I would have thought it to be lot more log normal than sort of a steep slope like that. Now, two additional questions in there. First, what is the distinction in this literature between talent and ability? For a very long time, at least when the human capital revolution first started, there was this major problem of identification of returns or whatever else you have, because we know human ability differs. And so how are the talent studies accounting for ability? Or if it's the same thing, then there were, as you know, a lot of, again, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and perhaps even later, a lot of twin studies were done in order to identify the causality, because we know they have identical genes. So are there any twin studies in this regard? I just want to point out that one of the, this is back, really dates me and goes back to graduate school. So in 71, one of my first econometrics courses or on the economics of education, that the Jewish dummy, a variable of whether you were Jewish or not, increase your earnings by something like 7 or 8%. And I raised my hand, and Oli Ashenfelter was the professor. So I raised my hand and I said, okay, are you telling me that if I convert to Judaism tomorrow, my earnings will go up by 10%? So I think embedded in that, sort of not a joke, but a real question, is the control for ability. I don't think, let me just give you my bias, I don't think there are too many policy conclusions that follow if talent is really ability. Eventually, the world will come to log normal distribution of ability, and I would suspect, but I think that's where a lot of the research output value added will be, as to some correlation study with ability. And I don't know if Chetty does that or not, but I think the assembling of all info is really, really fascinating.
Excellent question, Sujit. Thanks for the questions. Yeah. Please go ahead, because we'll run out of time. We have another 15 minutes. Yeah. Please.
So, excellent questions. On your first question, Dr. Bhala, good to see you. On your first question is why better neighborhoods matter. In their paper, they basically found that they were not looking at exactly able to unpack the mechanism. So it's a great question. But what they found is the better neighborhoods tended to have lower crime rates, tended to have basically better schools, and less fraction of single parent households. So those are some of the correlates. And then the question then becomes exactly as you're asking, but what really is within our control and what's not within our control. So, for example, school quality could be, but some of the family structures may not be. On the steep slope, I see that the next three set of questions actually are very related. So let me try to answer them together. So the way I define talent, which is a very undefined concept still in the literature, because we are one of the first few papers that are thinking about it this way, is kind of your ability at age 20, okay, which can be combination of your innate talent, let's say, ability plus training, okay. Now,
ability at what age?
20. That's kind of 18 to 20. That's how at the end of your high school. Yes. And now, in a way, what we do in this, the reason I think our paper was appreciated on the math is you can control for that, uh, by looking at the score at the IMO competition at high school, which is very predictive of future success. We're controlling for that, and we're saying two people with the same score, just born in two different countries, have very different outcomes. Now, what the papers by Agion et al., I thought was really interesting because they have the data for everyone who has served in the, because there's a requirement in Finland that you have to go to the army for a few months. And so they have the IQ score. So they can control for the IQ score, and they can look at within families across brothers, right? So IQ does matter. What you're saying, IQ score within the same family, higher IQ brother compared to lower IQ brother has higher chance of success. But what they were saying, what I thought was really interesting in their work was the IQ when you enter the army is strongly correlated and predicted by what your parents' income is. And so the idea there is their paper is about the social origins of IQ, right? And now, so that can be the way in your language one could think about it as a product of some innate ability and the opportunities or training that you've had. And you would like basically more work in trying to decompose the two. But I would definitely say that training has a huge impact. And a cool example, yesterday I had a great talk with this gentleman who's trying to build a math program in Rwanda. And Rwanda was not even attending in the International Math Olympiads until 2 years ago. And they've been building regional competitions at the and state level competitions and national level competitions. And now they have a pipeline of talent coming in, and it's incredible. For the first time, they got an honorable mention this time, and the quality is just improving. So that's where I think policy can change things, is take what's born. I mean, I would imagine the chance of being born as a talented person should be equal across all families. And then I think what I see as policy is how can we make sure that those who are born with that innate ability can be nurtured to supply, contribute to the world and to the country.
Okay, thank you. Charan, Dr. Charan Singh, you go next.
Excellent talk, and I had a chance to listen to you, Ruchir, earlier, and I thought this was best for our audience. You've been so very clear in your presentation. Thank you very much. Ruchir, for a long time, I was thinking what you bring in is higher education has higher returns, and you mentioned that your second or third graph where you show that people with 12 years of education then have a higher chance of patents and all that. But my own feeling of literature, and especially reading Philip again, and when I was there at Harvard and we used to interact also, he started his work on innovation. I thought most of his work, and I would agree with that, was on competition. How intense a competition you create, and that leads to more innovation or more creativity. And I would extend it to say that probably it leads to more patents. Similarly, the disruptive technologies also lead greatly to innovation and more patents. Now, why I ask this question is, if I follow your hypothesis, which I find very interesting and very useful, from the policy angle, it would mean that Harvard would perpetuate into more Harvard, and a metropolitan city like Bombay would continue to expand, but smaller cities or backward cities would hardly have a chance to progress. Going with the points that you made today. On the other hand, if I follow Philip Aghion and say that I provide opportunities for intense competition, and that leads to innovation, and that leads to growth, how would you react to that?
So great question. Thank you, Dr. Singh. So as I see it, in a way, if you remember the last equation I showed you, is the GDP per capita is a product, can be thought about as a product of return on talent and the chance of becoming talented, right? In a way, that's just an accounting identity. But the behavioral interpretation of that is if you raise the return on talent, if you create incentives to be that people with more talent will get paid more, you will increase the incentive and reason why people basically become talented. So from I don't see it actually as two different views, the competition view and the view I'm presenting. As I see it actually is we have to work on both sides. One is making sure there's equal opportunity, that people can realize their potential and at least have the, as Dr. Bhalla was saying, have the basic foundation, nutrition, basic education that they can actually try to convert. Second, we need to keep pushing, having a competitive environment where the market rewards talented people and your compensation reflects your talent, which then basically increase the incentive of people becoming talented. A simple example, going back to this math example, what I learned was in some countries, the person who gets chosen to represent their country in the national Olympiads, international Olympiads, is not meritocratic. It can depend on corruption and who your family is linked to. If that's the case, that's basically a return to talent is low, which can reduce the incentive to become talented. So what I don't see that, actually I see exactly as you want me to go. I see them as very consistent with each other. More competition can actually help build the pipeline. Last sentence I want to say is part of the challenge, your point on Bombay versus the rural areas, is to deepen the talent pipeline. We should not just focus on the top, but giving rewards and opportunities for the top can help deepen the talent pipeline. So the goal there has to be to make sure that it's not just a winner take all dynamics, but we can have a more deeper pipeline of talents to ensure that regional divergence doesn't happen.
Just to clarify, if the chairman can permit me one more question, a supplement question to that. Ruchir, what I had in mind was even the Silicon Valley. The way the Silicon Valley multiplies and perpetuates itself continues, but has not been reflected either on the eastern coast or elsewhere. So I like the arguments that you presented, and they're very logical. I totally in agreement with them. But I'm trying to think, would that argument that if I'm in a good place, if I belong to rich parents, if my education level is better, if I've been mentored by good people, the chances and the prospects are that I'll be more successful. But then you end up with the Silicon Valley just being Silicon Valley, not getting replicated elsewhere. So that is why my question as a policy maker, if in India I have to have 10 Silicon Valleys, how do I now go about replicating those Silicon Valleys? That's why my question.
Okay. Well, if you don't have anything to add, yeah. So
I can build on. I can respond to that later, maybe.
Yeah.
I have one. Can I say one sentence quick? Two sentences quickly. I think those are very different issues, Dr. Singh. One is, should we invest in these clusters, like in Cambridge, Massachusetts for biotech or Silicon Valley? I think that has a very different. I have another set of work. I'm happy to come back to talk to you about that. My message here is, we need to take a comprehensive strategy where you make sure everyone has access, the opportunity to contribute to the frontier knowledge, by investing in the primary opportunities and primary education, and you create a culture of excellence by making sure there's high returns to talent. And that's kind of how I would say it.
Yeah. So basically, yeah. Just to add to that, one of the things I referred to our India Vision 2050. One of the key elements which I identified was equality of opportunity, and I really see your talk in the context of that. So it's not just education skilling, but perhaps the talent hunt, so to say, and not just for hunting for talent, but for the macro objectives and the equality of opportunity. We have to go down into these rural areas and in families which are, like you said, not the big names, whatever they are, the names, and try to extract them in a way or set up a system. So I think that's doable, and I fully take that on board. I understand exactly what I think needs to be done. Sujit, do you want to add anything, or you want to ask another question? Otherwise, we'll throw it back to him to conclude. Okay, you done? Okay, yeah. So yeah. So Charan, is there any other question from the audience? Otherwise, we'll throw it back to him.
At least I don't see it in the chat box, but I think we can invite if someone wants to ask a question, please raise your hand or ask the question and put it, yeah.
Okay, Mr. Amit Kumar. Amit?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Very nice talk, sir. But I have to ask, like, not exactly related to, but it's related to talent. So measurement of skills in case of context of India. Okay. So skill mismatch. Lot of these tests are going on to measure the. So in where the country where social norm is, we give up importance to stability or government job exam. Okay, many skilled people choose a stability and going for a higher education, that which as well as the age bracket also, within that age you will able to achieve those jobs and not pursuing other careers. So there's a highly misallocation in the or skill mismatch in India, and from the perspective of huge mass unemployment for the higher education. So how you will defend that choosing something which is not basically my passion or my higher potential area as compared to giving me a consumption smoothing over the life cycle income. Okay, so because stable jobs gives me a consumption smoothing, that is the idea. So how this huge misallocation can we consider skill mismatch in the presence of high unemployment?
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Your
Thank you. We
question,
are
Mr.
running out of
Kumar.
time. Let the speaker answer. Yeah, please.
Mr. Kumar, your
Dr.
question
Agarwal.
is the jobs, some jobs offer stability, whereas if you try to go for some job that could be a passion, there's risk. And how can you allocate? I guess the first thing that I want you all to take away from my conversation is a lot of the policies that we're talking about, like skill mismatch, and these are, peanuts when you compare to what the potential of India is, given its population size. And so if we can unleash the innovation potential, 1.4 billion people in the world, look at the number of Nobel Prize winners we have, look at the number of international spokespersons we have, look at the number of any frontier, number of firms we have, we can be, even if we double, which will be still, much lower than our potential, we can totally change the income level, the innovation environment, etc. in India. Now, how do we get there? That's what I want to push on this 2047 agenda, right? That exactly as Dr. Virmani said. Now, take your question where it comes in here. This issue of stable job versus high risk job can be very, very quickly, that trade-off can shift very quickly if you can have high returns from doing things like scientific endeavor, being a scientist, being a mathematician, being an economist. If that starts paying much more, then that trade-off immediately shifts. And so I want to focus much more on this bigger picture, expanding that pie, than the current policy discussion, which is on these more at the margin, I would say. And I loved how Dr. Virmani summarized what I was trying to do. Thank you, sir. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So before I conclude and hand it over to Charan, yeah, I want to reiterate it actually for the rest of them. Yeah, you got what I'm saying. I think clearly it's very useful. We've had an earlier talk, I think by Dr. Professor Ogian, I forget, innovation. We've had a couple of them. But you're very right. I think that the focus is on, and my own focus has been on raising the bottom up, especially the rural areas which don't get the quality of skills and education. And I think your talk is a very useful reminder that simultaneously we must also go out and search for talent. This is something, in fact, 15 years ago, I had focused on the top 1% and 10%. I think if I remember, I used to say there are 10 million, brilliant people only if we could discover them and bring them out. But one forgets. So I think it's a very useful reminder with some hard numbers and the possible effect on productivity. So that's very useful. So we have to spend at least a fraction, maybe not the whole amount, but I think even a 10% focus on just getting the talent and spending money on nurturing it would not cost more than 10% of the entire skill and education budget of the government.
And the national
the entire
focus
states.
matters a lot. Having a national, at the high level focus and a strategy,
Yeah.
that is what can totally change that, having that centralized thinking about that. Exactly as you're saying.
That's exactly because our focus here is actually on central government policy and direction. So yeah, so right. So what the point is that it's not that costly actually. It's a matter of focusing on it, giving attention, and setting up mechanism because we are not used to it. We have not discussed these sort of things for a long time. And it's something completely new to the, let's say, the educational establishment, the skilling establishment, which is relatively new, etc. So yes, thank you for bringing it back into focus. I think it's very useful. And I, in fact, maybe I'll add to my own vision paper to include this this issue, at least a couple of lines, because I think it should not be forgotten. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And with that, let me hand it to Charan to conclude the session.
So there's another question which has just come. How to identify talent in any country? Is talent equally distributed in society, or is it something to do with the DNA?
So I actually I want to be quick on this. I have to conclude. I have to also go. But I don't know if there is a talent distribution. Dr. Agarwal has given us some indication. There is, of course, an IQ distribution. There are talk on S social quotient, all these things. So there are various tests and measures, and I'm sure there will be, like he had said, math Olympiad. Maybe we need to introduce that in our rural areas, for example, or in our small towns, some kind of a talent competition of that sort. But because it's relatively new to us, I think we have to think of how to identify and bring out these talents and promote it up the scale. So let me leave it at that. I'm sure they can get in touch with you if somebody has more specific questions, and you can ask Dr. Charan Singh for his reference into it. But I really have to conclude it.
No problem. Yeah. We have a new global talent lab which is focused on exactly this question. So next time we can have a talk on that.
Charan?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So let me then conclude. I must thank Ruchir Agarwal to have agreed to deliver this talk at a very short notice. I had interacted with him just 2 weeks back, and I really liked this idea that he brought up. And I said, you have to come and speak to our students, our listeners, scholars, and policymakers who come and participate in our webinars. I really want to thank you for accepting at such a short notice and delivering such a good talk for all of us. I have a good news to make. Next week, we have Professor Geeta Kingdon from University of London speaking to us about teacher shortages in India. So we will be doing that presentation from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. And I would invite all of you to please come and participate in that discussion. Teacher shortage, and Professor Geeta Kingdon is known, very well known for her work on this area. With this, let me also thank our chairman to conduct the proceedings and other participants who have enriched the discussion that we have had today. Once again, thanks to all of you. Good night.
Excuse me, sir. Sorry to interrupt, sir.